All right, guys, welcome to Ship Chasing Live, a very special edition. I do not say this stuff lightly. We have my favorite person in the entire fantasy football industry on the horn with us today. His face, a rare public appearance from Mr. Shawn Siegele himself. He is the founder of Zero RB. If you ever hear me talking about fantasy football, I am literally just parroting back things I've read from Shawn. I am not even lying. So on behalf of Pat and I, Shawn, welcome to Ship Chasing, man.
It's great to be here. And on the show, I think that, some of the very best RotoViz podcasts that have ever come out, feature you guys. You guys did them. Obviously we love everything that you guys do. So to be able to come on this one is a real treat.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you.
And you got your Chiefs hat on. You're letting your fandom show here.
I grew up in Kansas City, and we had all those Marty Schottenheimer home losses at Arrowhead. Finally, I think the Chiefs can now win at home in the playoffs with Patrick Mahomes. A dynasty could be on the way. You've got the best player in football for the next decade.
And I guess we got to get your take right out of the gate here. We have Damian Williams opt out. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had been going early third, mid third in some of these FFPC drafts. What's your snap take now on CEH's value?
I think it has to go up, toward that first round area. You were talking about, what you might do in the 12 slot. That's a tricky one. We'll talk about that on the show. He starts to be kind of interesting in that area. I mean, if they're going to take him where they took him ahead of the stars of this running back class, and then, not use him very heavily now that they need that running back. I mean, that would be a bad pick if they don't love him here. And certainly we know this is going to be a difficult year for rookies, but I think you've got to love him in fantasy.
Behind him, who are you most interested in? DeAndre Washington, Darren Thompson, Darrell Williams? Who do you like?
Well, Washington is one of those guys who does a lot of the things that we like, especially for sort of a later round or a zero running back kind of guy. We look at Edwards-Helaire as being one of these pass-catching running backs, and I think that's what they want him to do. That's what his slot would have been. If they need him to take a little bit more of an early down role now, then some of those receptions are probably going to slide to Washington. And we liked him coming out of college. Now, he hasn't been a star at the NFL level, but when you look at what he did last year, sort of moving ahead of Rashard there and being a very solid back for the Raiders, I think now that you move him into a much more explosive offense, we could see some big plays from him.
Excellent. Yeah, I think in this also, I feel like is a harbinger of what's to come as far as a uniquely chaotic season this year, as far as player scratches. I want to get your thoughts, and I'm going to try not to lead the witness with this, but how do you think that this year is unique as far as it pertains to zero RB and just in general kind of structural draft strategies?
This was set to be a pretty good year for zero running back anyway, with all of these rookie running backs who came in, created a bunch of committees. Even though running backs are going very early, we also have a ton of guys in that late range. But now that we're seeing, what has happened a little bit with MLB, what's happened with some of the entry testing with the NFL, some of these very intriguing committees are going to get blown up and become one guy. And so those guys are going to rise up. They're going to score a lot of points. We may see, more of that Austin Eckler type of emergence this season. And then the flip side of that, one of my favorite tools and one of my favorite guys, and obviously him, Blair Andrews has put together this Win the Flex tool for us, which does a variety of things. One of the things it does, it'll show you running back scoring compared to wide receiver scoring and sort of implied points by ADP. And wide receivers just blow running backs away at almost every ADP level. Now, you can look at that and say, well, if that's the case, then still just take those running backs early because the wide receivers are there later. But if you're looking at some of these, high stakes leagues or dynasty leagues, maybe your home league allows you to start 4 or 5 running wide receivers once you get into the flex. You're going to need all of those wide receivers now if some of them start testing positive. So before maybe you say, okay, I can get 7 big time wide receivers, and then your league mate says, well, how are you going to play all those guys? I found that you usually can, and you can destroy people in the bye weeks. But in addition to that, in this season, I think you're going to have a lot of chances to play them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, the one thing that's interesting, it even just philosophically and what people seem to not understand, I hear, robust RB has been this counter term to zero RB. And when you read the Taleb and the idea of fragility, like there has it's spelled out about robustness, and that's to resist the chaos, as the idea of the anti-fragility that can actually benefit from it. I think another thing that I'm hearing a lot lately is people will say, well, everyone can get COVID. It's not just running backs, it's wide receivers, it's quarterbacks. To me, this seems like an obvious point, but I don't think it is based on the responses. Why do you think running backs are going to benefit more from the COVID chaos than other positions in fantasy?
Well, we'll see the workload really shift in a way where, wide receivers, you have the 2-3 guys out there. With the running back, now we see a lot more committees and we see a lot more specific roles. You have the early down back, you have the pass catching back. But if you move from the backup position as a running back to the starter, you have a much larger workload change than what you see at the receiver position. So you have that. But then the other thing I think too is just wide receivers are going to score more points. So if you lose both of those guys off of your roster, you want to have enough wide receivers that you can really cover everything that happens.
That makes sense. So, on that point of wide receiver scoring, one of the big pushbacks on kind of in the industry against zero running back this year has been, we saw the wide receiver scoring be pretty flat last year. And so if you can take running backs in the early rounds and then still get a bunch of these wide receiver 2 types in the mid rounds, then, the theory goes that you would be just as strong as the early wide receiver teams and have much better running backs.
Yeah, and I think that there is some potential value to that. And we've talked a lot about with the running back scoring that you're going to get in those top 5 picks. I do think that there's a very strong argument to taking that one running back and then going to wide receiver. But when you're looking at wide receiver 1 scoring, wide receiver 2 scoring, 3, 4, 5, Jack Miller has been doing a ton of fantastic stuff for us. He wrote an article saying zero running back is poised to crush in 2020. Now, obviously, that's a way to get on my good side, but his article had all kinds of awesome stuff in it. And one of the things that he looked at is the wide receiver 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4 versus 5. And wide receiver 1 scoring 2014, 2015 is higher than if you look at the last 4 years, with the exception of 2018. I think that going forward, what we're going to see is sort of in between what we had in 2018 and 2019. And then when you look at wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, it hasn't had necessarily that same decline. So you do have a little bit of, that gap is closing, and perhaps you can do exactly what you said. One of the other elements, though, is that wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 scoring is falling off. And so when people talk about wide receiver as deep, I tend to think that, or assume that they're talking about, you can continue to get wide receivers very deep in your draft. And that's not necessarily what we're seeing. And so if you're in a start 4 wide receiver league, you need to understand that the wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 range is not scoring well. So if you take a running back 1, running back 2, you need to have a good tight end, and then you start attacking wide receiver, you can start to get in trouble in a hurry. And then the thing too is just that if you're going to start 4 wide receivers, you're going to factor in a little bit for injury. You're going to factor in a little bit for the bye weeks. Say you want to have 5, you want to have 6 good wide receivers, then you do need to load up from those first 3 tiers. It's easier said than done to get enough receivers from that group.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, Shawn, is you guys do a ton of great takeaways on win rate data for best ball, because all the information is there. You can back test it. You can use the Explorer to see which specific constructions yielded which specific win rates. It gets a little more tricky for managed leagues. And, we're now thinking about the FFPC main event, the Football Guys Championship. How do you think about zero RB from an evidence-based perspective when it's harder to kind of untangle the unique variables of the waiver wire, and that there isn't necessarily data that you can pull and just be like zero RB in FFPC main event drafts yielded this win rate? How do you think about that from an evidence-based perspective?
There are a couple of different things going on. I think that, we can see that having a lot of wide receivers in the first 10 rounds is very, very good for best ball, which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive. You might think that best ball is a little bit more running back heavy. The data tends to suggest that that's not the case. With the redraft leagues, like you said, you've got a lot more going on. I think that the waiver wire is very, very helpful for zero running back in terms of the season-long leagues. There are a lot of things that you can do there. One of the things that people tend to look at running back scoring and say, okay, we look at the full season and the running backs who have the totals that you need to be competitive or to build a super team, they tend to come from these rounds and their early rounds, and not think in terms of, well, where are the running backs coming who are scoring the big points weeks 6, 7, 8, weeks 9, 10, 11, playoffs? Where are those running back scores coming from, and can you actually piece it together? One of the things that I did before writing that zero running back article, and both before that time and then since then, obviously it's been a focus of a lot of different people, and certainly it's been a focus at RotoViz, tons of information coming out, really bolstering the zero running back idea. But before I wrote that article and tried to explain why I felt like it worked, why logically and structurally it should work, I had played, 200-300 leagues, relatively competitive leagues, contrasting zero running back with other types of drafting. And the zero running back win rate was just astronomically higher. It was very difficult to be unsuccessful playing zero running back as long as you attack the types of wide receivers that you want, and as long as you focused on the types of running backs later on that we're going to discuss in the show. Now, I think that the question following that is just with how much things have changed, sort of starting with 2016, but even more than that with the emergence of guys like Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, those types of players, you can't look at it all being the same thing. And so I think if you sit back and say, well, I was very successful with this in 2011, it's apples and oranges. So we do want to continue to ask questions, develop the information, develop the evidence, and make sure that what we're saying still fits today's NFL.
Yeah, sort of along those lines, like, can you walk us through a little bit when you're looking at the specific format of a league and then determining whether or not you're going to use zero running back or some version of zero running back? Like in the FFPC, for example, you don't get that third wide receiver. There's only 2 flexes. It's tight end premium, so you can be caught by teams that are weak at wide receiver but strong at tight end and running back. So like when you're comparing a format like FFPC to NFFC or other higher stakes formats that have more of an advantage at wide receiver, like how do you adjust for the FFPC specifically?
Yeah, there are a variety of things we're looking at there. We're looking at, as you mentioned, the structure of formats can play a big role. And you want to go into a lot of detail when you're studying your league to make sure it will fit with zero running back, or if it'll fit with running back, or a balanced format, maybe a stars and scrubs kind of thing. If you're in an auction, you want to know what's going to work for your league. You also want to know what the prices are going to be. And I think that in the FFPC, we do tend to see almost an overreaction to that 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 2 flex, right? Because your flexes can still both be wide receivers. And again, you go back to that win the flex tool and you know that wide receivers are hammering the running backs through this range. You want to probably still start 4 wide receivers. Now, because the prices are different, you have to ask yourself the question, how willing am I to get caught out? What will that mean? You had mentioned kind of, as we were talking about this before the show, what happens when you're 2 weeks shorter? And the zero running back does sort of build on itself. And maybe it's, just an experience that I've had, or maybe because weeks 12 and 13 and a lot of these formats are so important, they tend to stick in your head. But I mean, I've had a lot of huge scores, week 12, week 13. That only matters in the FFPC if you're in the playoffs. And so you want to make sure that you did construct a team that can get you there. And that's one of the reasons why I think, especially if you're in a top 5, top 6 draft slot, the one elite running back, which we tend to suggest in best ball, has, zero running back works well in best ball. One elite running back, if you're in the right draft slot range, works extremely well because it gives you both the high floor and the high ceiling. I think in FFPC redraft leagues, it's a very similar kind of dynamic. And the main event that you guys just did and came up with what I think is maybe the perfect draft. We'll see as the season plays out. In FFPC, you're able even to do the running back wide receiver, running back tight end start and still get receivers, right? The 4 receivers that you guys then stacked in there after the running back tight end start, you shouldn't be able to do that. And so, I mean, I love what you did there. I think that works really well in FFPC. At the same time, if you're not in one of those draft slots for that, you have to be very careful about not playing just totally into the hands of the top 6 guys. We can look at best ball and we can see that the bottom 6 slots have a lot worse win rate than the top 6 slots. It's only intuitive that that's almost certainly the case as well in redraft. When you're in those bottom 6 slots, you can run into a couple of different dangers. Number one, if you're chasing the points at running back, you're basically starting your draft saying, okay, I'm just behind, because you take those running backs in the second half, compare them to McCaffrey, Barkley, Elliott, Kamara, you're starting behind. But the other thing that happens is that you push the wide receivers back into a range where the guys who had those top 6 slots, they can now, through rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, end up with the best wide receivers too. And I think that when you look at your draft, and not to criticize any particular draft going on, because all the time, we'll look at things and say, oh, well, this guy didn't have a good draft, and then they win the league. But you have a number of teams in the bottom 6 draft slots here who have taken 3 running backs in the first 5 rounds. So not only are they behind at running back, but they've pushed the wide receiver value to you guys as well.
Yeah. So the thing that's started, been trippy for me to think about, and, Pat and I were sweating and we were happy to get, Alvin Kamara, because the modified 0 RB builds in the FFPC just end up working out perfectly for the spots you can grab value. I know I was mentioning to you before the show, I'm doing the Pros versus Joes draft from the 12 slot. And the thing I think about, especially in best ball too, is getting in these tricky spots where it's like, when am I going to make that detour for running back? And part of that has been, I don't necessarily love some of the guys you have to take in the 5th and 6th when you still have guys like Jarvis Landry and Diggs and Fuller and Boyd and Kirk and all those other wide receivers we like. How do you think about that as far as when you're taking that detour for running back, knowing we ultimately do have to take that detour somewhere, especially in best ball?
And, you mentioned 5th and 6th. In most of the leagues that I do, I really like to start in rounds 7, 8, 9 with the running backs and still get a couple more of those wide receivers early. At the same time, there are a couple of running backs in this range that I do like, especially if they drop a little bit. If you're in an FFPC where sort of strangely the wide receivers do go a little bit earlier in the startup draft that Pat was in with me, and Curtis, the wide receivers.
That's why they went earlier than usual, Shawn.
Right. So those wide receivers went early. We got caught out a little bit there. Again, it's very easy actually to get caught out. But if you have some of these running backs, Devin Singletary, Kareem Hunt, they're guys that I have in a staff draft that we're doing right now, fell to me sort of at the 6-7 turn. I think if you can get those guys below ADP, they're pretty appealing. But even more than that, I like the guys that you guys targeted in your other FFPC draft, the quad draft that you did.
Yeah, I wanted to pull that one up too. Oh, go ahead, Pat.
Well, I just wanted to ask, like, if you just could pick any round not to have to take a running back in this year, what round would it be?
Well, I don't think that you want. I know we say this every year, but round 3, round 4, maybe there's a guy in there, maybe there's a rookie that comes out, but the round 3, round 4 area is just a dead zone. It wasn't last year. I really do think it will be again.
And I did see you did a write-up recently where you did pull the trigger on Aaron Jones in the early 3rd, the kind of short list for guys I had been considering, the Miles Sanders, Eckler, CEH, and then it just gets gross for me so quick. But you taking Jones there made me kind of rethink that. Why do you think that Jones might be able to be a worthwhile target in that range?
Well, everybody knows that he scored a huge number of touchdowns last year, and that probably won't happen again in that same way. But if you look at his expected points from last year, so you take his volume, you translate it into fantasy points, I think he ranked number 5. If you look at where he fits in or maybe it was number 4, if you look at where he fits in the range of outcomes tool, one of the really cool tools that Dave Caban has put together that matches back with his historically similar backs and then shows what they do in the next season, he comes in that 4 or 5 range. So even with Dylan coming in, who I think is a fantastic prospect, I do think will cut into the workload. I mean, Aaron Jones, we're talking about one of the most explosive, most athletic running backs in the NFL. Those are the guys that I want to have. And with him emerging a little bit as a pass catcher last year, I think he has the full package to score very well again. Even once you move the touchdown numbers down, I mean, he's a guy who's going to score. That offense may be even better, which will balance out some of the other issues there. And again, in that second and then maybe early third round range, I'm very skeptical. Anything outside of the top 5, I don't like to take the running backs. But if you see them fall below ADP, which is what happened in the league that I was in, there was a RotoViz draft, and so we had wide receivers in that second round pushing some of the guys down. With that draft, I was able to start. I mean, if you have the number 1 pick, you're just so far ahead to start with. You have Christian McCaffrey. Then I went with Ertz and Jones. And then you start to really hammer the wide receivers. That's something you can do a little bit more in FFPC than maybe some of these other formats.
Yeah, and the advantage that the 1 seeds have, this was from the quad managed draft we did with Blair and Hassan the other week, and you see from the first slot, and obviously this has improved with the Damian Williams news, but being able to start C-Mac, Eckler, CEH, and then hammer those wide receivers, it's actually unfair to have a number 1 slot this year.
Yeah, I mean, McCaffrey probably isn't going to do the same things, but even once you knock him way down, I mean, he's the number 1 pick by such a wide margin. And when you come back through and then you get the people that you're going to get in rounds 2 and 3, it really is completely unfair. And certainly it's one of the reasons why people like to do enough drafts that hopefully they will get at least one number 1 pick in their 2020 season.
I've tried to talk Pete into James Conner a couple times in the 3rd round. It's like he's sort of the one dead zone running back that I'm a little interested in. Are you into him at all, or is he part of that dead zone crew for you?
He is, and this is something I probably have wrong, but the cost to me is very low, right? They make the rookie pick. They're adding a little bit more explosiveness to that roster. You go into the box score scout and you see James Conner, you see Benny Snell. Those guys are right there together in terms of what they offer. You look at what Benny Snell did toward the end of last season, and then I'm probably just going in and reading all the Benny Snell fan sites somehow. But the Pittsburgh guys seem to think that's a more even battle than people are talking about. So I think that Conner has some risk to his pass catching touches, which would obviously be devastating. I think there's more risk to his early down touches than maybe people believe as well. Snell's someone who carried a college team that had a tough schedule. And I mean, he was just a fantastic running back in college. I think closer to what you're seeing with David Montgomery and Zach Moss than people are giving him credit for. He doesn't necessarily have the pass catching ability that those guys have, which is one of the things that makes them so appealing if things should break right. If Cohen goes down, if Devin Singletary goes down, those guys could be huge. Snell probably doesn't have that, but could he hurt Conner? I think that he could.
So or first off, I should ask, have you done any FBG teams or main event teams yet?
No, none of the redraft ones yet. Those will all be coming. We did the big dynasty startup, and that one was a lot of fun.
Do you, one thing, Pat and I, this is the first year we ever did a main event draft this early. We hopped in one of their slow drafts right at the beginning of July, and we were really relishing it, even knowing there's going to be a lot of chaos, some things that could go wrong, because we've talked about this on the show a lot. As we go to Vegas, we see the boards, before our draft. We're drafting literally 24 hours before the season starts. And you got Darwin Thompson and Justice Hill going in the 7th and 8th round. It's almost impossible to do zero RB because you're having to reach 3 rounds for the zero RB candidates. We were enjoying, doing this early. What are your thoughts on, drafting later when the ADPs get more efficient, but we know more about the backfields versus the advantages or disadvantages of drafting early?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because in the seasons where I did a lot of drafts sort of end of July, those are so much fun, because the guys that you want, you can almost always get them. And then you feel like you came out of the draft with everybody, 2-3 rounds ahead of time. I remember it was just a couple of years ago that in one of the MFL 10 of Death leagues, I was able to get Marquise Goodwin and blanking on the name, but another one of those wide receivers in the 8th, 9th round. And by the time the season started, they were going in the 4th and 5th round. I'm looking at that team thinking, in the end, I ended up with like 10 guys in the first 5 rounds. I did end up winning, mostly because of luck, but not because of those guys, but they busted completely. So it's always interesting just how much change that there is. I have found that even though the early drafts are more fun and you think that you have more value going into the season, that the very late drafts, like the ones you're talking about, are more locked in playoff teams. It really seems like for maybe experienced drafters, I wouldn't say elite drafters. I mean, everybody thinks they're better than average. Everybody thinks that they, are the people who can do it. But for experienced drafters, I think the more information almost always helps you, even if your league mates are also getting more information. But I love the early drafts.
Yeah, the early draft is pretty fun, I got to say.
And one thing Pat and I have been thinking that's still crazy, and again, maybe it's the product of the early draft because we don't have the guys in camp and all the look who's running with the 1s and 2s and look at this cut on the grainy cell phone footage. But to me, some of these running back ADPs are pretty wild, specifically for the rookie running backs, Zach Moss, Antonio Gibson. And of course, I think we should just talk about it now. Where do you currently stand on this Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield? Because it is wild to me that Keyshawn Vaughn's ADP is not only lower than Ronald Jones, but by a significant amount. I mean, I drafted him in a Drafters Best Ball Championship team today in the 11th round, Keyshawn Vaughn. Wow. What are your thoughts on this backfield? I know RotoViz has, historically been high on Rojo.
Yeah, so this is a fun one. I'm not sure if you guys had a chance to go in and look at that. Blair was lamenting the fact that in your quad draft, his bargaining with Pat on where you guys would take Jones, that didn't exactly work out. He went in the 5th
He wasn't
round.
Lamenting it at all. He was super
he
psyched.
Was so happy.
Jones.
He was labeling you a closet robust running back drafter.
That's because I told him we had to take one before the 11th round. He lashed out at me.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting. Do you have a take now on this with sort of the test results coming in? How does this Tampa Bay running back? I know, Pat, that you are the fantasy community's foremost expert on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs.
Yeah, I guess
expert's a kind word. I'd go with sycophant.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine that it helps Vaughn to miss the, limited training camp version that they're going to have. So I would imagine that you'd have to expect some bump to Ronald Jones ADP to reflect the fact that he's now a heavy favorite to be the starter for week 1. And he could, I think the thesis for drafting Jones has been that he'll have a lock on goal line carries. He's not going to be involved on third downs because it'll either be Vaughn or Dare. It won't be Jones, most likely. But the thing about Jones is he still was involved in early down screens, and he got 31 receptions last year. I think 26 of them came on first and second down. So he could still get enough receiving work to add to a touchdown profile. So that's kind of the thesis, and I think Vaughn missing all this time makes it pretty likely that at least for the early weeks, Jones will be that guy. But I think if, you're going to get a discount on Vaughn to the 11th round, that's actually pretty enticing because presumably you would then expect Vaughn, not to miss 3 weeks during the season with COVID, for example, where, who knows, maybe Ronald Jones could. So I don't think that, Vaughn, I actually joked that I'll take Vaughn once it goes behind Darrington Evans, and maybe that's come to pass. So I guess at this price, I think Vaughn is actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, there are 2 backfields where I like both backs. I think they're both underpriced, and that would be the Bills and the Bucks. And the thing that you mentioned there about Jones and his pass catching ability and the fact that those catches came on first and second down, those are a little bit more sustainable in some ways, or at least not you're not as reliant on the game situation. The Buccaneers should be a fairly good team. Tom Brady should be a fairly good fit for the offense. He should have those dump off passes. And the thing with Jones that I think gets covered up because he was so bad as a rookie is that he's one of the NFL's more explosive backs. And so when he catches those passes, when he's in the open field, he has the ability to take those for big chunk plays, 20 yards, 30 yards, 70 yards for a touchdown. Those plays are huge for you in fantasy. And I think that we will have those for him if he is the starter. And the thing that is just so scary with Jones is that you could see him anywhere from being a top 10 back to not being used at all by week 4. And so I think you have to balance those concerns. but Ronald Jones came into the NFL as a fantastic talent. I think we started to see that last year. If this offense is as good as it feels like it could be, I mean, he can score a lot of points.
Pat, when Shawn says stuff like he could be a top 10 back, can we just get your hands just up here just to make sure you're not doing anything bad? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, give me a minute. Well, I wanted to ask because pull up that the draft board from the football guys, Pete. In our football guys draft, Ronald Jones went 502. So that's pretty early. I know you had an article on Ronald Jones recently that also got me very excited. And are you like, if he creeps into the early 5th or even the late 4th, like at what point are you feeling like he's just overpriced?
I think that he's a hard guy to select right there, because I do want the zero running back picks to either be another round or two later, or guys who just have so much pass catching in there with it. I mean, if you had someone like a Clyde Edwards-Helaire in that range, and clearly that's not where he's going to be, but every once in a while you have a guy like that who really is in that area, and you should load up. I think that Jones is probably a little bit high there, but every once in a while there will be a guy that I targeted right up until he started to get to, almost a soft cutoff, and wish that I had gone higher with him. Arian Foster in his massive breakout season, had a decent amount, but once he got a little bit more expensive, started to lay off a little bit. Eckler is someone where, he's basically on all of my dynasty teams. So it was great to have that last year. I wish I had had even more of him in redraft. He was one of those guys who was kind of expensive.
Yeah, and I'm curious your thoughts, Shawn, too, because one of the problems I've been running into when I do true zero RB builds is that thing that you described of, wanting to grab a couple more of those wide receivers in this 5th and 6th round. I think the ADP is settling, and we're kind of seeing that trio of rookie running backs, Akers, Dobbins, and Swift are kind of there. If you are looking to draft a running back after your first 5 picks, is that a territory that you're willing to grab one of those rookie running backs or potentially another target, or are you wanting to kick the can down the road further?
I think go a little bit later. I do like those backs, but one of the things that we talk about a little bit is that, they fell into the teams that last year were 30th, 31st, and 32nd in terms of expected points of receivers. So receiving expected points to the running back from those teams. Now, we would expect that part of what happened and part of the reason those guys were drafted is to remedy that. They'll move, more into the pack, you would hope. But the upside there, when you combine the receiving concerns with this particular season, I think those rookies tend to be difficult to pick. I'd like to see them fall a little bit further, because again, one of the great articles in Blair's The Wrong Read series, which, anybody who hasn't checked that out, make sure you do that. It'll change the way you think about fantasy football. Rookie running backs who start to fall into that 7, 8, and 9 round range, the win rates for those guys are phenomenal. So if we could see some of those guys, go a little bit more in a Nick Chubb range, go a little bit more in the Miles Sanders range before he kind of jumped back up into that, 4th, 5th range, toward the end there. Those are the guys we really want. And certainly we've seen them pay off even very recently the last couple of years.
Zach Moss is kind of borderline in that range right now. I know you like Singletary, but how into Moss are you?
I definitely try and get one of those two guys in every league. And I think I have Moss in SFB, a number of other leagues like that. Those guys are so intriguing, I think, or just the perfect players, because they both have enough standalone value to pay off their ADPs. But then if one of them gets hurt, then they're a league winner, right? And so I think that with the things both of those guys bring to the table, it's not going to be a clear-cut thing where one of them gets the goal line carries, one of them gets the receiving touches. At least doesn't look like that based on what their abilities are. They can do those things. And so you could get high value touches from both backs.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about Moss. I think he might have the edge on the goal line carries, and then could also be getting some of the receptions. And Brandon Thorne, he does the O-line rankings at Establish the Run. He was talking about how underrated the Bills' offensive line is, which I think is pretty interesting. They have a ton of continuity. I think they're bringing all 5 starters back. So Moss is a guy that I have been kind of getting steadily more excited about as the season's gone on.
That Bills team could deliver a lot of fantasy value for people this year.
Yeah. One other thing that, in recent years, I've started prioritizing more, and Pat and I have started prioritizing more in our drafts, is an upside quarterback in the middle rounds. The same logic of why late round QB works, I think, can make a good case for why you should take one earlier. Because if it flops, you just get a guy on the waiver wire. In this quad managed draft, we took a detour here to get Kyler Murray when we didn't really like the rest of the board. Are you going out of your way to target any quarterbacks this year as we all try to hunt for that next Mahomes, Lamar Jackson breakout in the mid rounds?
Yeah, one of the things I do at quarterback is I tend to take a quarterback as soon as I hit a flat part of my board. And every once in a while, this will come back to haunt you because, you say, okay, well, I've got it flat for a while, but then you go back and look at the draft at the end and realize, even though maybe you were going to take a guy above ADP, or maybe you had guys flat for even 30 or 40 picks, that you still needed an extra running back or wide receiver in there, even if it was a flat range. But if I don't have a guy that I want at those other positions, that's where I'll move to quarterback. And it really just depends on the league, because if Murray is there, after the 6th round, then it's a very exciting pick. You look at the roster construction explorer for best ball, and one of the things that you see is that the true late round quarterback doesn't work very well, right? You want to wait until after the 6th round. You can't draft a guy early. Even if they look like a superstar, you can't draft a guy early, which is what late round QB does tell you. At the same time, you want to have multiple guys from that middle QB area. Now, when we take that to the redraft, it's a very different situation. You're not getting the optimized lineups. You can do a little bit more of the streaming. You can match your guys up against the benefits of schedule. But if you have the next Patrick Mahomes or the next Lamar Jackson, that is going to make a difference. And so I would be looking for those upside guys there. A lot of the leagues that I won last year, I go back and look at them, and yes, a lot of them had Christian McCaffrey, but a lot of them also had Lamar Jackson. And if they didn't have Christian McCaffrey, then certainly a lot of them had Lamar Jackson. It does help you to make sure that quarterback that you are picking, you have some sort of thesis where they have a path to really outscoring at the position.
So when would be the earliest that you'd take a quarterback in one of these high stakes formats?
I think round 7, but you have to look at where kind of you are with your build. And we talked earlier in the show here about if it's a little bit more running back heavy, maybe you want to get one running back and then load up at the wide receivers. Maybe you've taken a lot of wide receivers and you hit a spot where your 0 running back target, you just don't need to take them yet, right? If you can get those same 4, 5, 6 guys you're targeting for running back in the 5 subsequent rounds, then don't force one. Take Kyler Murray and then grab those guys. Don't grab those guys early and then take, say, a Ben Roethlisberger, Baker Mayfield guy later. Now, that doesn't mean that those guys couldn't end up having a big season. You look at those 2 players, and there are scenarios in which each of them could outperform, but I think that, you'll end up with those other quarterbacks as you go through. When you have a shot at Murray or someone like that, maybe at a Dak Prescott, if the quarterbacks are going really late, make sure you grab a couple of those situations.
One thing that you started talking about in the past year or so, and Pat and I have kind of applied it, and it's really helped us out, is reverse engineering your draft. And I think one of the traps I used to get into with late round quarterback and be like, well, I like all these players here, so let's just grab them. We'll kick quarterback down the road, until you realize, wait, well, we want one wide receiver target. We want to take Shenault here, and we want to take Harry here. And then we know we're going to grab, Benjamin late. You start to realize that, oh, maybe there isn't a huge opportunity cost to taking a detour for that quarterback or that running back target earlier. How do you think about reverse engineering your drafts and using ADP to kind of help you do that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In that when you work it from the back, then you get a sense of maybe where you're going to take guys. And you think in terms of, okay, well, the longer I wait on quarterback, the more of these other players I can get. And yet at some point you have to take a quarterback. And if you find that the place where you take the quarterback, you had somebody else you really wanted, then exactly what you're saying. I mean, you could have actually taken that quarterback you liked a little bit more, because it still does cost you a guy, even if it's someone just like Lynn Bowden late, for example. If you lose him and you get a crappy quarterback, then you didn't accomplish what you were going for. And I think that same thing does happen with wide receivers to where, I don't use zero running back in every league. And every once in a while, I'll get some static from someone who will say, well, you didn't use it here, so you must not believe in it. And I think that it's a situation where, you want to be flexible.
We could laugh at that. That's absurd.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
People talk about wide receiver being deep. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But if you're saying there are particular guys that you like in round 8, round 9, round 10, take them, right? And if you're going to take them there, then maybe that does open up an opportunity to take a different position earlier. Maybe you take a running back where otherwise you say, okay, that's not what I want to do. If you have specific targets for that year in round 8, round 9, round 10, like must-have guys, you can take a lot more wide receivers than people think you can, but there still probably is a limit to where if you take 10 wide receivers in the first 10 rounds, it probably at some point will get difficult to play them.
Hang on, Blair, did you hear that? Just making sure Blair Andrews is watching. Blair Andrews is a zero RB extremist that makes you look like a robust RB truther,
Yeah.
Shawn.
Well, I'm glad that he is out there and that some of the other guys are. I loved his article about your team from last year. I know that there was a lot of controversy over the running back selection for week 13. And it was good to hear that you guys finished second despite some unfortunate circumstances as the year played out.
It's true. We had getting to co-manage, or I should say quad manage, and you see our email threads. It's great. We have Blair pushing the most fringe running backs. We got Hassan dropping in every single news report. We got side bets to, prove who is right. It's a good time.
I still have to go through and get all the side bets sorted out. There's like 4 more side bets I need to log.
Yeah. Shawn, one thing I wanted to ask you about, something that I've seen discussed way more this offseason than any other offseason for these large field contests is stacking in the main event. I think everyone had thought about it for like big best ball competition, obviously from a DFS perspective, but now we're starting to see people really hone in on it more. And even just these 12-team leagues. I don't know if I've seen you write too much about it. Is it something that's on your mind these days?
That's not necessarily something that I'm as focused on, because I think that so many things are going to happen before you get to that point. You want to have as much total value in your team as you can. At the same time, I don't remember if it was the team that finished first or the team that finished second in that 2013 primetime, but it was a massive week from the Chicago Bears where Alshon Jeffrey and sort of the backup quarterback put up huge numbers together that sort of launched that into a position where those big games from Jamal Charles, really sealed the deal. And so there are definitely situations where that quarterback wide receiver combination will launch the specific team that has enough points to win win the grand prize, win the $500,000 or whatnot.
Yeah, we're getting some comments here on the quarterback discussion about rushing and how important that is at the quarterback position. And I do think, in recent years, you're seeing guys like Mahomes, hopefully like Murray, Prescott, Jackson, that can pair rushing with passing. And it strikes me that the quarterback ADP this year is a bit more efficient than it was last year, where guys with huge rushing upside aren't really falling into the double-digit rounds. Is there a guy in those double-digit rounds, kind of after the range that we were talking about previously, that jumps out to you at all as someone that, could kind of pair that elite passing ability with enough rushing juice to be kind of the number one quarterback in that type of range?
I would say no to an extent, but Curtis and I did have some pretty interesting conversations about some of the specific people we were targeting in that startup that we did with you, Pat. And Gardner Minshew is somebody who has a little bit of sneaky rushing ability. He's not going to be, your Lamar Jackson, obviously, your Cam Newton, your Deshaun Watson, but maybe brings a little bit more of that athleticism to the table. And then if DJ Chark is who we think he is, and then more importantly, if the number one late round pick in all of fantasy football does what he's going to do, then I think Minshew becomes an interesting quarterback there.
Let's talk about Leviska Shenault, because he's someone that I'm super excited about. I know you're a fan. What makes you so excited about Leviska, Shawn?
Well, I don't think that I necessarily have a ton more to add after the bold predictions from you and Frank Kretsch on our bold prediction shows. I mean, that was the best argument for him that I have seen. But he's an interesting guy in that he's maybe more of that Julio Jones type of player. Now, he's not that athletic, but that type of big-time player than a lot of these other guys. And I think that there are some people, Lamb, there are a lot of people in this draft alike. But when you look at the combination of talent, total upside, and price, I mean, the price on him is crazy, right? When you look at where he went. And you think about some other guys who maybe fell a little bit going into their NFL careers. And the top couple of people who jump out to me are people like Juju Smith-Schuster, A.J. Brown, specific types of red flags. And red flags even made sense, right? It's not like we're saying, people didn't have any idea what they were talking about. But I fell a little bit, and now are these massive values. And it's interesting, you pull up the box score scout, you see those top comps for Shenault, and the top two guys there are A.J. Brown and Juju Smith-Schuster. So that gives you, I think, a lot of confidence. The third guy there is Michael Thomas. So if we're talking about people who are in the NFL right now who are top comps for Shenault, it just doesn't get any more exciting. And again, the price, even if you're wrong, what does it cost you?
Right.
I mean, it could cost you like a 17th round pick. I always end up reaching for him by like 3 rounds.
Shawn, what is your thought? It's almost a cliche now. You can't listen to any podcast or scroll through Twitter without someone saying, because of this offseason and not having the training camps in the preseason, the rookies are going to start slower. You can't load up on these guys, especially the receivers in your drafts. What is your thought on this unique season as it pertains to rookie production?
I think that you want to be aware of that, and you always want to balance a little bit your total rookie portfolio in terms of, or even in individual drafts. You don't want to have so many rookies that you need to have a lot of those guys hit to make the playoffs, continue to move along. But a lot of it comes down to price. And one of the things that we talked about earlier with FFPC and the running back situation, a lot of that is priced in or overpriced. I think you want to be cognizant of individual drafts where maybe people are looking at that too much, or again, if it's a late round, another person that I know Pat absolutely loves, and it's very difficult to get him in drafts with Pat, Brandon Ayuk, right? So you're looking at somebody else who, again, it's easy to say this after the draft, and the 49ers are trying to prop up their guy, but could have been one of the very first wide receivers taken. There are some red flags, but there are some very positive things. Had he been in a different draft, you're looking at him 4, 5, 6 rounds earlier. And so the pricing there with Samuel out, again, it's going to be hard to be wrong in a way that really hurts you. And that's one of the things that you want to do as you're constructing your team is build it such that when you're wrong, and you're going to be wrong, I mean, I'm personally wrong constantly, you want it to not hurt you to the point where being wrong for other people hurts them. You want the upside for the picks that you're right on to win your league.
Yeah, so we've covered 2 of the wide receivers that I'm super hyped on. The third one is Jalen Reagor, who I've just been trying to get everywhere. In the email thread that Pete mentioned for the Quad Manage team, Blair and I got into an argument about which wide receiver was a better comp for Odell Beckham Jr., Jalen Reagor or Henry Ruggs. Do you have a favorite between those 2 insane views?
Well, it was interesting, and I don't think that Blair will mind me mentioning that when we had our rankings summit for the Dynasty Command Center rookie guide, that Blair was very high on Ruggs and then was asked where he would take him. And at that point, he was a little bit more circumspect on his ranking. Reagor is so good and is in such a good situation that I love him for the long term. I am maybe a little bit nervous about the price that you guys paid for him in maybe this particular draft. But I mean, he fits everything that we want in terms of a rookie who could actually be one of those guys who has an impact right away.
Yeah, Pat bullied me into taking Reagor here. This is actually
you bullied me. By the time we got here, I was worried we wouldn't get Boston Scott.
Yeah. Actually, that segues us to another. Well, no, let's keep talking about the Rager thing. My thing on him, and I think this is maybe Sean's point too, is just when you can get Shenault and Ayuk, 3 or 4 rounds later, and that's generally the range where I've been needing to hammer running back. That's why I've just been kind of passing up on him. But Pat has definitely sold me on the ceiling for him, and that offense looks pretty wide open. Right now with Jeffrey on PUP, Deshaun Jackson is aging out of the league. It does really seem like he could fall into a really early target share. So I'm excited about him. I do agree that ideally you'd be taking him probably in the 11th and 12th and not that early.
And that's Rager, where it usually goes.
Yeah, Rager, somebody who did have the top score in our wide receiver prospect lab in terms of the post-draft rankings. Now, a lot of those guys were very close together, so I don't want to make it sound like, he was head and shoulders above the rest of the guys. That's not the case. But when you look at somebody who did have the top score in a draft that's pretty loaded, now I did a recent comparison between 2014 and 2020. 2014, a lot more really top-end talent than this draft. But when you look at Rager compared to some of the other guys, then you start to like his price better, especially in a situation that, at least on the surface, looks very good.
One thing that's been interesting too is I've started to do a bunch of drafts, and I'm drafting these 0 running back targets. Is I just find myself drafting rookie after rookie after rookie. I know Pat and I took a detour for Boston Scott here. Flyer on Jerick McKinnon. We took Darrell Henderson in that other quad managed draft, but on the most part, it seems like the rookie RBs are the screaming values. Do you feel similarly? And maybe give us a little preview of the forthcoming 0 RB target list.
Yeah, so I was mentioning to Blair that my SFB draft was basically exactly the running backs that you guys had in your quad team. And so I actually was able to get Kerryon Johnson and Tarek Cohen, and then the guys that you had there, not DeAndre Swift, but every single one of the rest of those guys. I think that is the perfect list of running backs. I think that when you talk about those rookies, and it's going to be difficult for rookies this year, the flip side of that is that if we do have a lot of positive tests, and hopefully we won't, there still seems like there's at least a possibility that if the individual players manage the things that they need to manage, that things will go more smoothly than what it seems like. And that would be wonderful. But if we do have a lot of testing, it will open up some opportunities for these guys. One of the things I looked at recently, our Dynasty ADP tool is really cool. It lets you go back and look at where people have been, over the last 5-6 years. Pat's done some really cool research on some of that kind of thing. One of the things that was interesting is that when you have a top 100 draft pick drafted over some kind of running back incumbent, you can look from the charts and their Dynasty ADP just craters. And it happens more quickly than you would think. Now, that's not good, right? I mean, it's just very straightforward that when you have somebody drafted in on top, you have some more competition. That's not going to be good at a position where being the starter, having the volume is so crucially important. But the speed with which it happens, I think, is surprising. The only way that kind of thing does happen is if you do have some rookie running back impacts. Another thing that's, Blair's gotten the wrong read. A lot of things showing that rookies do have some good impact, especially at the running back position. And I think the prices, one of the things that we talk about with 0 running back, or something I think is important about 0 running back that maybe we don't talk about enough, is that one of the things it allows you to do is just be very aware of price all the way through your draft, right? So you want to be cognizant of what you're paying, and you want it to be important to you what you're paying all the way through. And when we're paying those prices for those running backs, I like what it gives us, even if maybe the most likely scenario. So many other things that we do rankings wise in the fantasy community focuses on the most likely scenario, when in fact, what's most important is actually some of these other scenarios. And so some of the scenarios for those backs that you guys drafted are very exciting. And again, the price is minimal.
I just want to ask you a little bit about Jonathan Taylor, as you talk about, he's sort of the flip side of, one of the running backs. Marlon Mack is now in a position to lose a lot of value, like you said. Taylor is someone I know you're really high on, but he has been extremely expensive in Dynasty, and that has translated to redraft, where he's typically going noticeably ahead of Swift and Akers and, some of the other running backs that we expect immediate roles for. He's been going typically after Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and he certainly will now. But is he someone that you're interested in in redraft? And were you able to get as much of him in Dynasty as you wanted?
Maybe a little bit more than I wanted in terms of what's actually happening now. There was a pre-draft startup I did that was a lot of fun. Still like the team, but I had Cook. I traded back in to get that second pick, even in the first round. Took Jonathan Taylor. Scores 100 in the running back prospect lab. So you're talking about a Saquon Barkley type of talent. With the concern that maybe he's not quite the same level of pass catcher, which at least for fantasy purposes, when you look at the difference between Barkley and say Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb, maybe the best pure runners in football, it does make a big difference, right? But you look at Taylor there, and so this is a pre-draft league, and then the Chiefs are on the clock in the NFL draft. Taylor is there, and they're in a situation where maybe their other targets at other positions were not there. So you're thinking, maybe they'll take the luxury pick, which, now that they've signed Patrick Mahomes to this gigantic contract and we have a season where tons of people are opting out, maybe you do need the running back now that your running backs are also opting out. But maybe that pick should have been used at a more valuable position. But Jonathan Taylor is there. And I think especially they don't have Damian Williams, and, Jonathan Taylor was there. If he had gone to the Chiefs, so much value. This Colts team is an interesting team. It's an exciting team. Phillip Rivers not really good now, but fun from a fantasy perspective in the same way that, Ryan Fitzpatrick is fun. And so the team's going to move the ball. It's going to score some points. I think in almost any other situation, it would still be exciting to see Taylor. But he's a guy who is squeezed on both sides, right? Because Marlon Mack, a better back than I think he gets credit for. You're talking about an above average running back that you have to compete with. And then Hines, someone who scored great on all the running back projections, came out, had that rookie season where he caught a bunch of passes. Then last year was weird with the quarterback who didn't really use him, but someone who has blazing speed, good pass catcher, a great fit for what Phillip Rivers does, which is just dump the ball off every play. And you look at those two guys, I don't know. It seems like a virtual death sentence for Taylor. I think he's still so good that if you get caught in the third round, certainly if he falls to the fourth round, and for whatever reason you don't like your other options, then I think still maybe take him.
Yeah, I want more of him, but he's just been so expensive. How are you playing tight end in FFPC with the tight end premium? And I think that's one way you can kind of differentiate yourself from some of the running back heavy squads. Are you making it a priority to get an elite tight end?
I do. It's something I've always done, and to an extent to my detriment, where I've had a lot of Rob Gronkowski when he's been injured. But you look at the roster construction explorer, the early tight ends are so important. Now the flip side of that is we're looking at maybe a limited number of total players. So we have a lot of teams, but even with a lot of teams, you're still looking at, basically Kelsey, Kittle, Ertz, some of those guys who are really carrying this. But the win rate added when you select that early tight end is gigantic. That those guys were good, but what it does within the context of your overall team, and if you don't make other serious mistakes as you go through, then you're looking at a win rate that will allow you to play and turn it into a money machine. Now, maybe not, you're not printing huge amounts of money, but you can go into that very confident based on that. Now, redraft is going to be different, but when you're looking at formats that aren't super deep, and FFPC is certainly not recreational. It's not like we're starting just 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, no flexes, that kind of thing, to where the starting lineup becomes everything. But it's still not a super deep starting lineup. And when you have that elite tight end, it's almost like having an extra starter.
So in the best ball win rates, I noticed that the taking one tight end early is awesome. But if you double up with like 2 tight ends in the first 3 rounds, then your win rates aren't quite as good. So do you think that's like, why do you think that is? And is that something that you think it might be more best ball specific? Like in the FFPC, have you ever done like a double elite start? Because the ADP sets up this year to where you could go with like a Kittle and an Ertz, or maybe even like a Kelsey Andrews?
Yeah, the two guys, then you start to create rosters, I think, where you just don't have enough of the combination of wide receiver and running back early. And then if you wait a little bit longer, I think there are some guys, and this is maybe the case every year, and it's one of the reasons why people take tight ends in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, even though historically that hasn't worked. That's been a very poor approach. So we either want to take sort of the 2 tight end approach with the elite tight end, or you take a 3 tight end approach, but you wait a little bit and make sure you get multiple guys from that 9, 10, 11, 12 round range. If you take the elite tight end, then kind of doubling up, especially if you take them from what you might consider the tight end dead zone, that tends not to work very well. I do think, and I have had some luck with doing the double elite tight end. There have been some teams I've had where actually one of the tight ends went down. And because I had a 2 tight end construction, but the other tight end was a star, I was able to still have decent tight end scoring. And so it worked out that way. That's one of the constructions that maybe I like more than probably is justified based on what the win rates have been.
One tight end thing that's been kind of tripping me a bit in drafts is, I too have been trying to get one of those elite tight ends, but if I miss on it, I've noticed some situations where that second tier and third tier will get jumped up together. And I really like that third tier, the Hawkinson, Gesicki, Font tier. I like targeting those potential breakouts. But what I've noticed is sometimes you'll have a Higbee or a Hunter Henry especially, and these guys are starting to fall, and that gap is getting closer. I'm curious, how do you think about that tier where historically those mid-range tight ends have been a bit of a trap? But are you open to drafting some of those guys like Waller and Ingram, Higbee?
Those guys have that combination of upside and red flag that I think makes them tricky, in that is still a range where we are wanting to hit our last sort of favorite wide receivers. And so it's another situation where that drafting in reverse really helps you. It sets you up to know kind of what you're going to need to do, and maybe those tight ends a little bit later you still like and are still going to be better once you consider, okay, my wide receiver tight end combination like this is still better than the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, Higbee's been interesting because Pete and I have talked about how like he was going so much later in Scott Fishbowl than he has been in the FFPC. Like he was almost down in that Hawkinson tier, where in the FFPC he's usually very expensive. He went in the 5th round of our main event, in the early 5th, 504, ahead of Ingram, ahead of Hurst, Henry, that whole tier, except for Waller. So I do like the upside, but I think I've been trying to be price sensitive about him. Are you into Higbee at all? I know you like Gerald Everett.
It is something where on some of these teams, if I have 2 guys and I like both of them, but one of them is less expensive, then I almost always go that route and end up with not a ton of ownership there. You look at Everett before he got hurt, and I don't know that is something where you should say, oh, he was clearly the guy, and Higbee only scored because Everett was down. It's not easy to do what Higbee did. I mean, you have to have a lot of respect for that. But we also want to look at the full season and understand that the full season numbers tend to give us a little bit better perspective. And, if you're drafting Gerald Everett, you need to have had some other guys, right? But I think that Higbee, you're also going to need to build some other people in. And so I would prefer to have Everett maybe as a 3rd tight end if you go that route, as opposed to having Higbee at the price.
So one thing I wanted to circle back and kind of pin you down on, so to speak, is thinking about the back half of the 1st round of these drafts. And let's say within the context of a main event or football guys, not best ball. And, are there any of these running backs, let's say the Miles Sanders, Kenyon Drake, Austin Eckler, that are realistically available there, that you're willing to deviate away from a wide receiver from maybe for a structural reason, or just because you like the player and think they have a similar ceiling? Or when Shawn gets a pick at 9, 10, 11, 12, are you just pretty much automatically going to be going wide receiver or tight end there?
It's pretty much automatically wide receiver or tight end, because I do still think that sort of top 6 at receiver, that there's a big gap between those guys and the next group. When you're looking at, what a DeAndre Hopkins can do, what a Tyreek Hill could potentially do, Julio Jones starting to enter that range where there is more risk of perhaps a decline. And when you're paying that much, I mean, Julio Jones, you would expect to be phenomenal, but you're just, especially at that price, you're trying to remove as many risks as you can. But Julio Jones, again, someone who could just have this monster season. I think when you're looking at the potential for putting two of those guys together, or one of those guys with one of the elite tight ends, that has too much upside and too much safety to go the route of the running backs. But I did recently trade DJ Moore for Miles Sanders in a dynasty league where my wide receivers were just a lot stronger. And so there are some situations where a guy like Miles Sanders, I think, has such a good profile. You know, if you were to tell me that Miles Sanders was a top 5 pick next year, that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, he's got what you want to continue to ascend. And
he
so
might get that this year.
It's true. Yeah. Have you seen his ADP, Shawn? Because it seems like some of these guys in the FFPC mains and FBGs are taking him 5th, 6th overall at this point.
That's enthusiastic. There's nothing to say that couldn't work. I mean, what do you want from a guy that early? You want someone who is a big time talent. You're not banking purely on volume at that price. With Sanders, you've got the big time speed. We saw him make big plays. You want someone who's in a plus offense. You know, the Eagles have plenty of question marks when you're talking about Rager being the wide receiver 1. I mean, that's not a no-brainer that offense is going to score tons of points. But there's a lot of upside there as well. And then somebody who could catch passes. So, you know, I wouldn't take him that early, but Miles Sanders is a guy that there's a ton to like about.
That makes sense. All right. So Pete and I started this podcast so we could talk about our team. And I feel like it's time we get into that. We just drafted 2 teams, the main event, and then the squad managed football guys team. Shawn, which of these teams do you prefer?
Well, I mean, it's so hard to say that I prefer the running back team because that's, you know, blasphemous. And you guys nailed the 0 running back team so perfectly. It is a situation where that early pick gives you such an advantage, right? Alvin Kamara, a guy who is going to score a ton of points. Mark Andrews, someone who perfect for tight end premium, even if he doesn't maybe have the volume of those other top tight ends. And then you shouldn't be able to, again, I mean, this is the thing I think about benefiting from some of the things maybe other drafters are doing, or just from what the ADP is in FFPC, because you simply should not be able to get DJ Moore, Terry McLaurin, Cortland Sutton, and Jarvis Landry. Now, you know, it was certainly disappointing to hear that Landry may not be 100% week 1. Somebody who, fantastic player, always undervalued. But when you look at that team, then it has everything, and it's going to be safer. But what you guys did with the 0 running back team, you know, that has the chance to be a $500,000 team.
Oh man, I'm getting hot here. Yeah, no, and that's the thing too, that, you know, when you look at the price structure, you know, people, I always say, no, you're never going to post a true 0 RB draft on Twitter and get a round of applause. Everyone's going to always go straight to the running backs. They're going to think it looks like the vomit emoji, and they're going to say you're done. But again, if we are truly playing a contest to win $500,000 when the second prize drop off is like a $460,000 drop off or whatever, I mean, you have to be employing some kind of hyper fragile strategy of some sort. You just are not going to outvalue pick your opponents on the way to $500,000. So that's how I was thinking about this draft. I think that's how all of us were. And yeah, it could fall on its face. But as you mentioned, Shawn, if certain scenarios come, it has the range of outcomes to explode.
Well, and you have Murray, who could be someone who within the tournament format scores massive points. You have George Kittle, who could not just be the top tight end, but maybe he gaps the field at tight end. And then you look at some of those running backs, the potential to emerge there. But at the wide receiver position, it's not just your top guys, but the other players you added to that. We don't know how the season will pan out. We don't know just how good Kirk could be. We continue to post articles about McCole Hardman, you know, every week. N'Keal Harry, someone that we had a lot. Obviously, we already talked about Shenault. You want to have 5 top 16, 17 wide receivers with this draft. if it plays out that way, the points that you are sitting on there week to week, but also in the tournament basis, if you get what we kind of expect to happen with some of those running backs, then you're looking at weekly point totals that are really out of this world.
N'Keal Harry is a guy that I know you really like, and I think I got him from you in a dynasty draft, or I outbid you in an auction where you just had decided you could kind of already had too much of N'Keal Harry in dynasty. So I know you just have a ton of them, but he's someone that I think post Cam Newton signing, I would have expected a little bit more excitement about. I think Brady leaving was already good. Like Stidham would have been better for him than Brady, I think. And now with Newton being added, that's another bullish sign. He was not good last year. He was not efficient, but we saw him coming off of the IR, struggling with injuries, and we saw a very limited sample. And can you just talk about how good of a prospect he was and why you're still on him?
Well, he's one of those guys who really hit the things that we're looking for in terms of age-adjusted production, in terms of market share production, having that explosive ability, having that big body. When you look at him and A.J. Brown, they're very similar, except Harry was a little bit better prospect. So you're looking at the difference between someone who's proven what they are on the NFL level and someone who just simply looked the same as a prospect, because we know that not all prospects who have similar projections are going to have similar outcomes. But there were a lot of things to like there. He's got the sort of the big body explosiveness of someone who could not just be a good receiver, but could be a great receiver. So again, at the price, I think that the risk reward there is very good. One of the things with Harry that's kind of interesting, and maybe sort of the opposite from what I was talking about with maybe seeking out the Benny Snell fan sites, is that when you go and you read about Harry in the New England media, they just do not seem high on him. Right. Talking about someone who doesn't run routes very well, looks slow out there on the field. And so I think that there's some genuine and maybe justified skepticism that comes along with that, because if a guy simply isn't doing it out there on the field at the NFL level, just because he was good at Arizona State doesn't mean he's going to be a good player. At the same time, we just have to look to last year with someone like DJ Chark, who had some very positive elements to his game, but wasn't the same level of prospect, and then just completely blew up. Again, a little bit apples and oranges in that people were raving about Chark in camp heading into his second year. We would like to see a little bit more buzz on Harry, probably just that they're practicing well. And that's one of the things that will be difficult for the season. It's not just that, players aren't going to get the practice and that's going to hurt them, but we're maybe not going to get as much of a read on where people are. But again, in terms of risk reward, in terms of price, Harry's one of those guys who now has been so beaten up that even if you're wrong, it's not going to hurt you that much.
Are there any other second-year breakout guys in that later range that you have your eye on? I mean, like last year, you mentioned Chark, but we had Gallup. We had Sutton. He was more in the 8th round range, but it was an awesome year for second-year breakouts. And then there's some interesting guys like Paris Campbell, who he wasn't nearly the prospect that Harry was, but a bit of a similar situation where he struggled with injuries, and we've only seen a small sample. Could be a better quarterback situation for him this year. You have Hunter Renfrow, who was like weirdly efficient and got a ton of targets. And, most of his competition is either rookies or underwhelming veterans. So anyone else I didn't mention?
You just have some of those guys, maybe like an Isabella, where, if you're talking about someone who's going to be like a Chark, it would have to be somebody who comes completely out of nowhere. That's how unexpected it was, or at least unexpected before we got to see how he played in camp. Somebody who really does come out of nowhere. So if you want to have the next Chark in terms of really the next Chark, then you have to have the guts to take somebody that other people are going to make fun of you for, or that just really probably shouldn't even be rostered to start the season. This is a fantastic year for the second-year wide receivers. I do think it is a little bit heavier in that range where you are going to have to pay some for most of the guys not named Harry. I think that the prices still leave you upside, but they're maybe not double-digit prices for the most part. I think that for me, the rookies, and again, some of this comes back to the price and the risk, I'm less excited about those rookie wide receivers who have single-digit ADPs and more likely to load up on the guys who are going in that Ayuk, Shenault range, even maybe guys going very late, like a Claypool or a Hamler.
Wanted to pass along this hypothetical thought experiment question, although maybe not hypothetical if you've ever done a RotoViz mock with staffers. So if you landed in a draft with 11 other 0RB or modified 0RB drafters, what would you do?
Yeah, so this maybe isn't that hypothetical. And one of the things that, I do like to talk about in terms of wide receiver being very deep and going back to that first part is that wide receiver is only deep if people are kind of giving you the wide receivers. If people are going out there and taking them, then, you get into round 3, round 4, round 5, and they're gone. I was in an Apex draft the other day, Mike Brody, one of our favorite people, and it was a mock, so it wasn't as big of a problem, but there were a lot of guys who either have written for RotoViz or, friend of the site kinds of things, at least have read some of our stuff influenced by that. And the wide receivers were gone right by round 5. And so even though I had a top 6 pick and I had started with one of those, okay, this is going to be a single elite running back draft, it didn't work very well because the wide receiver depth that you got in that 3rd, 4th, 5th round was simply not good enough to have the kind of team where you're going to exit the draft and be excited about. So yeah, I mean, if you're in that sort of everybody is doing it, you do want to make sure you're going to get the wide receivers because you simply can't have a good team without them. We've got a draft going on right now that's fairly wide receiver heavy. And one of our guys has 4 very good running backs, but, doesn't have a wide receiver through the first 6 rounds. And, it's going to be hard to get points.
Yeah, and I think the other way to think about that is, and we've mentioned the Win the Flex tool, is at basically every point in the draft, the running backs are being overdrafted. So if you get in a draft with a bunch of people that don't view it that way and draft the values, everyone will draft wide receivers through, 4th and 5th round, and then everyone will turn over and start drafting the running backs in the 5th and 6th round, and they'll go appropriate to the value. But that is a pipe dream that will never happen. We have the big dog, Evan Silva, in the chat. I'm going to present this without comment in hopes of actually wondering Shawn's true reaction to this. Can Shawn comment on the counselor? Are you familiar with the counselor, Shawn? He takes a sip of water.
Dramatic pause.
This is a situation where I think will lead to something where I'm made fun of on the Solis report going forward because I don't have the right context.
Okay, that's what's so good. So I'll make this very simple. He is a massive fantasy personality on Instagram, and he is heavy, robust running back this year. He's pushing all of his peeps to draft 5, 6 running backs out the gate. I have over the past year or so been posting a lot of his videos. People get really riled up about it. So in a lot of ways, Shawn and the counselor on these two ends of the structural spectrum here. So I think Silva was just trying to see if you wanted to, start a beef with the counselor.
I love all the different perspectives. And, if people will help us, get better prices on the wide receivers, I love that. And just, having the different voices out there, people, will come to me time to time and ask, if people aren't doing it your way, do you think it's wrong? Or, that kind of thing. No, I love it. I love all of the different things that the people like to do. And, all you have to do is go back and look at those $500,000 or, a lot of the ones to this point haven't been 500, but you look at the main event grand champions, you look at those guys who are winning. I mean, we've got players out there who have won, 2, 3 main event overall titles. They do it with different kinds of teams. The same guy will do it with different kinds of teams. And then across that spectrum, you have people who have different strengths, different weaknesses, and build teams that win the overall title that, have the 3, 4 running backs early, that have the 0 running back. And so I think people should draft the way that fits with their strengths. And I think they should draft the way that they have fun. And certainly if you have guys that you like, draft them onto your team. Don't take a 0 running back team if you have a 3rd round running back who's your favorite player in the NFL. I mean, get that guy. So I like all the voices out there.
Yeah, Shawn, you are just the absolute nicest guy. Even Gretch is mad at me for not fully explaining the counselor to you. Yeah. But it doesn't matter. Shawn is too nice, and that's why we love you. And maybe to wrap up on that note, I mean, I know Twitter is an absolute cesspool. It's an absolute hellscape of nightmarish, fever dream every single day. That said, we would still love to have you. Are we ever going to get you returning to Twitter? I even have a proposal for you, but I want to hear your answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that everybody has to kind of decide for themselves what they do the best, what works the best for them. One of the things that I think that we've done with the site is that we have some people, running our marketing, some of our individual writers who are fantastic with it. And I love what they do. Obviously, Curtis has done a fantastic job for us. And so, getting people to, fit their skills and, fit what they like about it. I mean, fantasy football needs to be something that you love. You can't get into a situation where it becomes a job and football is ruined for you, those kinds of things. And so, trying to match some of those things up. And I found that, I think, and maybe this is just an excuse, but that my research, that my recommendations for people, that, what we do with the site or my part of it is better when there's maybe less feedback. And that's not that, we get emails from people all the time. We try and make sure we respond to the things that they want. And, we love the interaction that we have with some of our Slack channels, those types of things. But, for me, I want to keep the focus on the articles, the drafts. People know that I'm playing. They know that if I say these are the guys I'm going for, that I'm drafting those guys in high stake leagues. And, if those guys go down, I go down with the readers. And so, those are the things that I'm trying to make sure I bring to the table, for our readers, for our site.
Yeah, and while I miss having you on Twitter, it speaks in the volume and the quality of your work, just churning out articles. And when I say churning, I don't mean in some kind of volume kind of way. I mean just quality after quality. So we're not going to keep you here too much longer, but I do want, again, if for some reason you do not have a RotoViz sub, if you are not devouring every word that Shawn and those guys are writing over there, you legitimately are doing it wrong. I don't think there's any better in-depth research that is going on, focusing on structural draft strategy, historical win rates, all the things that are actually important above just player selection. No one does it better than Shawn Siegele. So thank you, Shawn, for coming on the show tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. I don't know that that's 100% true, but if you come to the site, you'll get to read things from people better than me. And, I'm very excited about what we're doing. We've got a lot of new writers who are doing a great job. The people who have been with us, what we're doing from a tools perspective, what Mike Beers brings to the table for us there. It's a very exciting time. And this is a fun time of the year. And I appreciate you guys having me on this time of the year, without being someone who's going to bring you thousands of extra views and listens, through Twitter. So thanks for having me, guys.
We'll tweet this at the counselor and we'll get on his Instagram feed. So it's all good.
All right, guys. And I know some of you guys have been sending in reviews for the show. We will get those on another show and review your teams. Thank you for those iTunes reviews. Speaking of podcasts, Shawn does do, you guys are going twice a week now on the Overtime Ireland podcast on the RotoViz network. So check that out. That's a very fun listen. Follow Shawn on Twitter, even though he won't tweet, at @FF_contrarian. And thank you guys. We will see you next week.